Hello and welcome to the Open Fire podcast with Dave and Tom. Open Fire is an honest and informed dialogue on fire safety issues through collaboration, research, innovation with some thought leaders throughout the industry. Your presenters are myself, Dave Calvert, Operations Director at Frankham Risk Management Services, and with me in the studio I have my friend and fire expert, it says here.
That's very kind.
CEO of CLM Group, Tom Gilbert. Hello, Tom.
How are you, Dave? You well?
Not too bad.
Good. You look like you've had a hard day of filming. Is that what you've been up to today?
A bit of filming, bit of recording, in the studio. You know
Wonderful.
But we're into, is this week 4?
This is week 4, yeah.
Okay.
Do you feel like your mind's been expanded by all the episodes
I feel like
so
we're
far?
getting on to some of the good subjects now.
This is the one I've been looking forward to, actually. I don't say that on every episode, for the record. This is actually the one I've been looking forward to.
He does say that on every episode.
I don't, Dave. That's not true.
You obviously crave disappointment, Tom.
I do, absolutely. Well, look, thanks, Dave. And thank you, Aman Sharma, CEO of Totus Digital, and Pete Wise, who's Director of Excellence at PartB. I think that's probably the best job title ever.
Thank you for noting that.
How do you get to that? Did you start as a director of mediocre?
So it's a promotion.
Well, actually, I'm going for at the moment a job rebrand, and I've decided I want to be director of fair to middling. So I think that's probably the best way.
Set expectations.
Slowing down a little
I think
bit.
you ask any fire engineer, and one thing you don't like is exponentials, and I think excellence is an exponential. So for the fire engineers out here, fair to middling is quite good. It means a reasonable rate of growth.
Yes.
Nothing more, nothing less, no hiccups.
Absolutely.
That's my story for life.
Fantastic.
So fair to middling, occasionally moody. As well.
So, Alan, what do you do? What does CEO of Totus Digital involve?
I've been asking myself that for the past 5 years. No, it's a myriad of things, really. I mean, the thing I'm probably most known for is trying to balance my role in the private sector with that of working with central government as a appointed advisor, either directly from ministers or otherwise. Working now with the independent building safety regulator as well. So I find that my day to day and my week to week is more of a challenge, actually balancing, putting an advisor's hat on with that of what a textbook CEO should be doing, which is coming out, speaking to the industry, developing relationships and ensuring that we can keep the lights on at Totus Digital headquarters.
Absolutely. Well, look, thanks for being here. I know it's difficult if you're in the fire engineering world to get any moment out the office is a fortunate thing. So thanks for joining us. We're going to be talking about the golden thread, and I think the golden thread is probably one of the most overused and misunderstood terms that fire engineering and fire safety and legislation has ever created, actually. And I think you two are probably two of the best people to be in here to kind of unpack it for us and indeed for our listeners. So I suppose the first one for me to you, and if that's all right, is can you explain what the golden thread is? Where did it come from? What does it mean for everybody?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of its origin, I hope everyone will recognise that it was a function of Dame Judith's interim and final report following her independent review into building regulations and fire safety. And you're quite right, actually. I would back you up completely in your assertion that it's misled a lot of people for an insignificant reasons, a whole myriad of reasons, really. And I can't really, maybe I'm a little bit biased, but I can't really understand why. We worked quite hard, and when I say we, the Building Regulations Advisory Committee, which is no longer a scientific advisory committee in what's now known as the Ministry of Housing again, this week anyway. And BRAC was asked to produce a definition for the golden thread, and so we thought, well, this is a matter for a specialist subgroup. So the Golden Thread Working Group was founded, chaired by BRAC's chair at the time, and deputised by myself. And we came up with a 2-part definition for the golden thread, which carried on then into the development of secondary legislation. And actually, when we talk about this, I think it's always sensible to reflect on the source of why we talk about this thing called the golden thread and Judith's work, and remind ourselves of its simplicity. And that is, very simply, that the golden thread is defined as the information you need to understand your building and the management processes that need to be in place for you to enable the development of that information. So the headlines there are, it's the information itself, and then it's the information management processes. So if we take that two-part definition, how have we seen that now manifest in secondary legislation? I very much hope that most of the industry has worked out that you can't go to one specific set of secondary legislation to work this out. We reference golden thread in at least 3 or 4 different pieces of legislation, and that's by design. That's very deliberate, not least because there are nuances and context for design and construction related purposes, and the in-occupation regime as well. So the before I get into a little bit of that, because I'm sure we'll discuss that a little bit later, I think the key point really is recognizing that there is, if you like, a golden thread within the golden thread that we've developed, because we can go back to its source and say, this is why we defined it the way we defined it. Industry consulted, there was some input. That was an industry definition, really, that came together via that working group. And it needed that locus, it needed that attention, because you'd be unsurprised to hear that Dame Judith takes a considerable interest in the golden thread itself. And I always describe it as the underpinning tenet to this new regime now we have for the higher risk buildings. Without the golden thread, this thing falls down.
Agreed. And
without us contributing to what is no longer a concept, it is a tangible thing now that we are doing here with the golden thread. Forget about having any entropy for this new regime. So for me, it is absolutely critical.
Pete, do you obviously, in terms of the golden threads being a new aspect of the way that construction is going to deliver for the end user that tangible information, how does that golden thread really differ from the way that construction has traditionally administered itself in terms of giving that? I mean, for example, like Regulation 38, for example, part of me feels, is it really that much different to Regulation 38? I know it's deeper, but Regulation 38 was about providing the right amount of information to the responsible person so they can manage their building safely and maintain it for longevity. And it always felt like a bit of a toothless tiger, actually, within building regulations. But how does the golden thread differ from the way we've done this stuff before?
Well, I think it differs in 2 ways, and it isn't necessarily about the information, because I echo exactly what's been said previously, in that it's just essentially the building, information about your building, that anyone would reasonably expect that you would know if you're managing that building effectively. So if you wanted to have some building work done on your building, for example, what do you know about it? So if you've got to alter something, what do you know? It's no more complicated than that. In the same way that if a regulator was to ask you about a facet of your building, there's no reason why you should not understand it. The question comes, I think, in the fact of it being managed, which where the difference is. See, Article 38 was very much about providing a set of information, which is defined, whereas the golden thread is about the management as well. And I think where it comes from, and then you've got the final angle, which comes from what would you use that information for? So if you're developing a safety case, for example, or you're changing a building or demonstrating to a regulator that you're going to build a building properly, you need to be able to do that and present that. So you've got to be able to articulate it, marshal it and understand it, as opposed to be given a folder in paper or vellum with a quill, which is my days with crayon. I actually come across that before, Tom. I have done.
I don't doubt it.
I have, yes. That sits on a shelf. So although I think the basic context of what it is, it's just building information, it's about the understanding and the management. So, for example, when you see the regulator now talking about building safety cases, they talk about BS 9997, which is organisational management of fire in fire context. So it's about how do you understand your risk, how do you articulate that, and how can you do that without the basic information? You can't do that.
No.
That's how I would see the difference.
There's an extra bit that works at a substrate level, to those very, very important concepts that Peter's talking about there, and I speak quite often about that distinction between the regulatory requirements that are imposed upon us now as duty holders or consultants supporting duty holders under Part 3 of the Building Safety Act. So that's our in-flight or new higher risk buildings, and those that we have already within our built environment stock. And you very rightfully pick upon Regulation 38 as a I love the phrase toothless tiger. I think that's a very, very apt description of, an information management provision, because that's what it was. You had to bundle something up and pass it over. But so too did you for Regulation 39 and 40, which doesn't get the same airtime, does it, as Regulation 38? And no one did it. And in fact, there's one example of an attempt at taking or a local authority attempting to take a duty holder to court over non-compliance to Regulation 38. And perhaps your viewers can go away and have a little research of that to see how that went. Not very well.
No,
for the claimant was all I'll say. But the key thing with Reg 38 specifically, and this has been something of a challenge for us in both the Building Regulations Advisory Committee, but also now the reconstituted Building Advisory Committee, and I continue to chair the technical review for Approved Document B. And believe me, we've been busy thinking about Reg 38 and its locus, really. And you'll have seen various amendments to Approved Document B, for good, and some might say for worse as well. And Reg 38 has been significantly expanded upon. We also considered it within the development of BS 8644 Part 1, which incorrectly gets referred to as the Golden Thread British Standard. It's not that. We can get onto that a little bit later on, but the fundamental difference, the fundamental component between what Reg 38 was and is now, and what the Golden Thread is now, is that for Part 3 of the Building Safety Act, your Golden Thread will consist of everything from Part A of the building regulations, Schedule 1 of the building regulations, all the way through to our now brand new Part T. Not to be confused with Party, and that's a bit of a taboo word still in central government. So
they do like a party.
They do like a party, yeah, allegedly.
Currently, yeah.
I wasn't there, but Part A through to Part T is the totality of what you would be expected to demonstrate to the regulator. This is how we've discharged our duties under the Golden Thread, under the high-risk building procedural regulations. Yes. That then changes for your in-occupation regime, where the locus narrows down significantly to, Peter's already used the safety case example, to Part A and Part B, so structural safety and fire safety specifically, unless the duty holder determines that there are secondary elements that they need to consider as relevant and accurate and information that they want to maintain in the in-occupation regime. That's their choice, and it's entirely appropriate to say, well, actually, if I'm maintaining my Part B information to be able to present to the regulator via my safety case reports, I'm going to go one up, and I'm going to suggest that maybe my Part F and my Part L and my Part O is relevant here as well. Unless I'm making material change to the building, I don't expect any of that to change. But if it does, I want to be able to convey that information. Now, that extra bit is a choice that duty holders have. But Part A and Part B is where you're going to be benchmarked as a duty holder for your existing HRBs. That's helpful when you think about those two buckets as exactly that. You know, I'm a developer and I've got some stock in my pipeline, and I've got some existing stock that I need to consider, probably by a completely different directorate in my very convoluted and complex business structure. But over time, you'll start to see a rationalization of this process where Golden Thread information is being passed over at Gateway 3 to whomever is going to manage that HRB, and they will then inherit the richest form of that information, the most relevant, the most accurate, and hopefully the most accessible version of that information at its point in time, arguably its inception. And the challenge will be then for them to transition that and manage it appropriately in the way I've just described. I've got everything from A to T now that my building is occupied. My first plot has got its first tenant in. What do I archive? What do I keep away in the electronic vault, if I can put it that way? Yeah. And what am I going to maintain on a daily, weekly, monthly basis so that I can churn out my safety case reports, so that I can present a body of information when Peter's engineers or my engineers turn up and ask for the REBA 7 fire strategy from which to do the fire risk assessments. That's the promised land for me, to be able to have the deliverables like the fire strategy, the primary item that is coordinating fire risk, whatever the part of the technical life cycle that you're in. And to do that, you need information.
I think that is the fundamental difference between Reg 38 that Tom was bringing up and the Golden Thread. The thread is time.
Yeah.
isn't it? It's
Yeah.
the past of the building, but also the present,
Absolutely.
and importantly, the future, the occupation of the building, and recognition that that's going to change. And one of the questions me and Tom would discuss, we were going to ask, is what's changed from the past, how we used to do it, and the past. And the truth is that nobody had any real consideration of the future. There's Reg 38, which says what we've got now. These are the documents. Give us a bit of evidence for what we've got in place. There's no sort of forethought of the future.
Yeah.
And that's given rise to there's a phrase used commonly now. It's got to be said that this golden thread information should be held digitally. And I'll be interested in both of your thoughts in how that's interpreted, because there's obviously an awful lot of platforms that have sprung up and are available. Frankham, we have our own platform designed for holding people's golden thread information for them to deliver it to the regulator or whatever. How's your interpretation of that particular element of holding the information digitally, as opposed to presumably the old-fashioned way of sticking it all in a filing cabinet somewhere amongst dozens of other filing cabinets?
And it probably doesn't say digital anywhere. We probably just think it does.
I mean, I think that's it. You summed up the difference. Is it's not in a filing cabinet on paper. It's electronic, isn't it? I mean, you're more of an expert than me on this area, but especially now with the capability of electronic filing systems, for want of a better word, we're not talking about having to locate a file in a dusty office. As years ago, you go in and you talk to someone. I can remember again given a job to go along and look at a building and assess a change they wanted to make, and I said, "Do you know anything about your building?" "Not really, there's some files there, mate." And I opened it up, unfortunately. The fire strategy was there. And that was just luck. But we should the point is we should never be in that situation again. The point of the matter is that where we're able to hold information electronically, and with the capabilities that we've got, and I think it's interesting about the amount of information we keep, because we talked about Article 38 information. One of the things I would see now in practice, if I was managing information, would be a greater depth of detail. And with electronic systems, you're able to do that, particularly with drawings and the ability to search. So it's just a different level, isn't it? And I think a lot of that is born out of the ability of the systems we can create to do that. So that's the way I'd see that.
Yeah. So Tom's rightly identified that the term digital that we use in a very colloquial way still today came, the etymology of that was from Judith's phrase "digital by default." And her interim and final report is littered with that sort of reference. Everything is digital by default, and she's a very clever lady. I think we all realise exactly why that phrase.
We've got her coming on the podcast later in the series.
Show her this clip.
Happily after.
We will.
Yeah. And the logic being applied behind that by her team was we were so, particularly in fire, we were so averse to innovation and actually trying to advance and leverage some of the digital infrastructure that was available to us 10 years ago, quite candidly. But we refused to. We just didn't, for whatever reason. And I think that's been evidenced very, very clearly. However, digital as a term in itself, by its very own definition, is hard to legislate for. It's quite a, it's quite a, I don't know. I'm struggling to find the word for it, but it implies a lot of different things potentially.
Hard to define.
It can be quite partisan. I think. Yeah. I mean, if you take something like building information modelling as an example, one BIM manager's interpretation of a model is not the same.
Agreed.
Much like fire engineers, by the way, because we're very good at disagreeing on things that we actually agree on, but we just want to disagree on it. So we don't, I'm not suggesting that there's a practical element to that, far from it, but you'll see the phrase electronic as almost like a substitute for the term digital in the regulations now, and that's because there has been legal precedent for that term in other primary and secondary regulation.
Is there sorry to interrupt there, but is there a good reason for that? I suspect I could probably answer that, but just to put it to yourself.
Do you know what? I lost many an hour debating this in working groups and committees. I think it's because if you are in data and if you are in, you might be a CTO, digital means something very specific to you. You know, we've seen the advent and the acceleration of, and it's a whole different series or podcast maybe, but you know, machine learning, AI. We've seen just how much that's come on in the past 6 months, 12 months.
Yeah.
You know, the difference between what one machine, say ChatGPT 3.5, and then you start playing with ChatGPT 4. That was months in the making, and you can really see the difference between the two computer language models. And I think if you're a CTO, the definition of digital means something very specific to you, but we weren't meaning that. We were meaning not paper-based.
Yeah,
electronic, exactly.
Because there's a history of people losing paperwork.
Yes, and then take that back to the original comment on digital by default. Default means that actually you don't even think about doing this thing on paper is what the message was.
Yeah.
So
it's pretty difficult to get forensic after a fire if your own ends were made out of paper.
Absolutely.
You know?
But this is also about a journey that the industry is going on, particularly our industry. And BS 8644 sets that, you know, it's a milestone, for example, that we want to achieve, because I want the fire engineers of the future, and I know Peter does as well, to be thinking synonymously with information management processes as they do computational analyses.
Yes.
I'd love to see building information management actually form part of undergraduate degrees and master's degrees, and you know, actually have it as a discipline in itself. But change management requires step changes, and you know that's why we're taking those proportionate and careful steps forward to make sure.
So, Aman, you've seen a lot of platforms that have sprung up over the last 8 months, is it, or probably the last year or so? And what are you seeing? Are you seeing a mixture of good and bad? Are you seeing, you know?
I've seen a broad church actually of different examples, and it's a really good question, because we're always going to get a part of the industry that tries to leverage the opportunity here and you know, claim an enterprise solution, one size fits all. We're never going to quite pacify that, but that they should come with great big buyer beware signs on them, because you can't procure your way out of this. You know, it's just impossible. What I really have been encouraged to see are software vendors actually working in partnership with each other. I've seen several examples of that, and actually pulling together an ecosystem of different solutions. And usually you see this on, I'm sure Peter will attest as well, on major infrastructure projects. High Speed 2, for example, I'm quite happy to name check that particular project, which has done a huge amount of work rationalizing and consolidating a lot of, you know, fragmented systems, and said, well, here's our ecosystem of digital solutions, electronic solutions, and each one does this. So we have an EDMS that does that, we have a CDE that does that, and so on and so on and so forth. All provided by different organizations, but they all perform a very specific function for their golden thread of information. And that's what I think I want to see more of, you know, irrespective of the scale of the project, a recognition that each tool or solution plays its part in the discharging of the duty, as opposed to my thing does this and it does it for everything, because I think that's quite a difficult thing to claim.
Yeah. And you're very reliant on the software vendor understanding something that broadly the fire industry itself doesn't necessarily understand, despite its simplicity. There is a real misunderstanding still around what the golden thread is. So do we have confidence that a software provider is going to understand it more so than the fire industry? And beyond that, do we trust fire industry professionals to understand software enough to come up with a solution? So I think that's a very complicated...
I think one of the issues for me as a fire engineer is I recognise that I am one small part of any kind of design team that's building anything. So when you're looking at managing information for fire, you know, which is where the 9997 stuff comes into, about managing risk full stop, what are you trying to do with it? So it's I get concerned when people are driven by the software as opposed to driven by the business case.
It's a fair point, and exactly what Tom was saying about the, you know, a software people, the people to design it, because they're not, you know, they're not au fait with what we're talking about.
I mean, it has to be a partnership.
Yeah, indeed. We came up with something called the FRMS Matrix, which, Aman, you were kind enough to give us some feedback on, very useful feedback. And the key auspices of that was to be low cost. Uber low cost, because we're talking to clients in the social housing industry
Totally.
who have no money,
Yeah.
and any money they do have comes from their residents. So that was the driving process. But ultimately, you're talking about a receptacle, a data storage facility platform that is entirely reliant on the quality of the information that goes into it. So if the client isn't putting sensible data into it, it doesn't matter how much this all singing, all dancing. It could be tens of thousands of pounds. We do it. It's like £200 a block. If it's tens of thousands of pounds, it doesn't matter. If the data going into it is garbage, data coming out of it is garbage, and
it has to be accessible for the end user.
Yeah.
Because if information is accessible and available, they're not going to use it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to in the end with any system. It's basic system design, isn't it? And that's getting that move over in terms of understanding how that works.
Yes.
Because one of the bits that I think is often lost, and dare I say it, with fire engineers, is obviously we look at any problem from the fire point of view, But I'm sure that when you're if you're managing social housing, fire is one aspect of a problem with doors. When you're looking at managing doors, there are lots of other aspects, aren't there?
Of course.
So when you look at the information that needs to go into managing doors, fire is a subset of it. So it's an important subset, but you need to be very cognizant of the way in which you're managing your building information generally, so you can use it to maintain that building.
I always said that social housing's risk management would always improve. They just switched the television off, because they started to focus on improving something, and then something would happen, and then they'd move over there, and this unfinished risk management process would happen. And I remember many years ago going through a fire risk management process, and then there was an asbestos release somewhere else. The whole fire risk management process got completely wiped out. All the budget went, all the concentration went, and we were immediately worried about asbestos. And then you do something else, and then there'd be a Legionnaires outbreak somewhere else, and then all of a sudden asbestos has been forgotten, fire's still forgotten. Now we're worried about Legionnaires disease. So I mean, I think that there is that problem around having the right amount of resources in a lot of these organisations to actually focus on the risk
If you can
management
solve that, Tom,
they
I
need
think
to
you'll be
deal with.
doing well. I mean, the inquiry into COVID has just highlighted that everyone was focusing on the last problem, which was flu.
Yes,
No one was horizon scanning and looking for COVID.
of course.
Yet the information was available, and I think that's one of the issues about risk management generally, isn't it? About looking at which is outside the golden thread, I know, but that is just general risk management.
Well,
isn't it?
I don't think it wholly is though.
Okay.
I think in particular for safety management systems and the evidence that we are being asked to produce within safety cases and safety case reports. I think that absolutely is data and evidence, information that you want to be able to link back to a single source of truth. You need that golden thread of information to say, I'm showing Dave why I am discharging my duties to embed a safety management system across either my portfolio or just this single HRB.
Yeah.
But most importantly, I can show him where that information's come from.
Yeah,
It's over there. There's my golden thread, and there's the ecosystem that's delivering it. But just to pick up on a point you mentioned earlier, Tom, and it's absolutely right to reinforce that, as Peter says, the relationships and that support structure, if we want to call it that, should we use the culture word? We probably should. That needs to be in place where, how many times, for example, I can probably guess, PartB have had a scope of services delivered to them by a client who thinks they know what they want.
yes,
Same for CLM probably, and the same for Frankham's. But then I would hope, as owners, directors of our respective organisations, our teams are directed to go, that's not what you're not asking me the right questions.
yes,
Yeah.
And that doesn't always happen. That's the culture I think that you're referring to there. It's that buyer beware approach that I think I would really, really hope that anyone who is being pressed upon by a vendor, and thankfully it's not happening too much, to suggest that procuring this one thing will do this many, 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 many different things for you for your golden thread.
yes,
So they start to ask the question of why and how,
yes.
because my duties are this. Show me how that does help me do
Absolutely.
that.
And I think that outside of the golden thread, that bleeds into everything that happens in most industries, but in fire in particular. That whole buyer beware thing, and we're going to go through a huge process of increased prevalence of testing in brand new projects. Most of the tier ones are now getting to the point, and obviously in the passive fire protection industry, for me, is around we only want a tested solution for that particular, for that building, all tested solutions. the reality is, as lovely that is, it's impossible to test everything because some furnaces just aren't big enough, right? So that's impossible.
Yeah.
And the other aspect around it is, it doesn't matter how good your BIM model is. It doesn't matter how good your early engagement was. The reality is, the mechanical and electrical contractor is still going to put the pipes in the wrong place in the hole, right? So actually, you get there ready to install your detail, and lo and behold, buyer beware, I'm expected to do something. And I've either got a client that says, right, that's your fault that the M&E contractors put the stuff in the wrong place. Give me another tested solution. You say, well, there isn't one. What would you like me to do? And they say, well, best endeavours, please. And you go, well, the regulator's not going to accept that anymore. We need to act, which is why, obviously, if those things happen, it is a notifiable change to the regulator, you know. And people say, well, you've just got to design it better. And actually, it's not designing it better. It's actually building it properly is actually where we've got to get to.
The thing is, with all that, is capturing that information for the golden thread, no matter how it becomes available to us.
Yes.
And the information is, when you're looking at change management and reasoning behind it, which is where the fire engineer should come in and make that information available so it can be used later on. Either to show to the, I mean, we're talking about showing to the regulator. That, of course, is a given. The point of the matter is, it's making people safe, isn't it? And when it comes down to it, we've got to be able to demonstrate that.
You say about capturing the information, Pete. And it's it's a fair point, but it's and this is probably broadening the conversation away from the digital sphere, more talking about the golden thread more generally in terms of building safety cases. But that letter, which I'm sure you guys both saw in May, from the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, and so it's Lee Rowley, who was the Minister of State for Housing, Planning and Building Safety. I presume he's not still.
He's on the shadow.
And a paragraph in that: if you own or manage a high-rise building, you should already be keeping much of the information required for the safety case reports. It would be extremely unusual to have none of this information to hand already. Now, we've met with a lot of clients, I'm sure you have as well, who don't have this information. They haven't kept it. Is that unduly optimistic of the government to have expected that, or are they just misreading the landscape?
Bearing in mind the portfolio is 100 years old, or 200 years old, or 300 years old.
I think that there are two issues with that. Is one, is it unduly optimistic, given the fact that we are quite a way on since the fire at Grenfell? The question will be, if I was a regulator, put my old regulator's hat on, is, well, why haven't you sought to find out and create that information, even if you don't have the basic information?
Yes.
Now, the question would then be, to what degree do you need to go with that? But I think people will be surprised how much of the basic information still isn't available.
Yes.
You know, when you ask a simple question to someone, certainly even before building safety cases, just to carry out a fire risk assessment. You know, it wasn't that long ago that London Fire Brigade did a test of cause and effect for smoke control systems.
Yeah.
And you'd think, of course, everyone must be on top of that. And they weren't. You know, look at the regular alerts that come through Cross. You know, you look at that, and I think that's one of the concerns, is that the message doesn't appear to have got through. And I think it is, you know, to come back to the old philosopher's gambit of, you know, what would the man on the Clapham omnibus say? Of course, I'd expect these people to know that information.
Yeah.
And that is not a function of digitalise it, it's a function of having it in any format, isn't it?
Any format, yeah.
Any format.
And we're in a situation where you can't even find the original regulations or the original guidance for some of the buildings being built. Like, you can't get it. Like, you actually can't get the guidance to even do anything retrospective and consider.
And
what
would you say that might be the government at the time that sent the letter, but have they got a fair grasp of what it's actually like out there
I think what we need to be cognizant of is that we have a new regulator that is getting to grips with regulating in a sector that it hasn't previously regulated before. That's the first comment I think I'd make. That was a letter. I don't think we have the time, but I think I could get into the source of that letter and why it was felt that it was appropriate to write to, interestingly, building safety managers. It was addressed to, wasn't
Correct,
it?
yeah.
I don't recall that passing the upper house, actually, but there we go. So that's something in itself as well. But as you rightly point out, David, it was a letter from a previous administration. I think we do need to note that, albeit the Chief Inspector of Buildings is still the Chief Inspector of Buildings in the arm's length body. The important message, I think, to still take away from that piece of correspondence is, if it was produced, and I would suggest maybe there is an element of this to it, to address disproportionate costs being applied that then get indirectly recovered from the people that we do all these things to, residents. the regulator is going to take a particular position on that, as is the Ministry of Housing, and rightly so.
Yeah.
So if there are consultancies tempted to be going out there, as we know they are, charging upwards of 30, 40, 50,000 pounds for a safety case report, I'd ask them to think twice about doing that and to test whether or not they're actually delivering value, both to their clients, but ultimately to the people that matter the most in all of this, and that is the residents.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of the origin behind that particular correspondence. What I would say is that in response to your original question, Dave, do they understand sort of what's happening at the coalface is essentially what you asked me. I have every confidence, really, particularly now that we've had the refresh, if you like, of a new administration coming in, looking at it, the same problem statements with a fresh set of eyes, that the right focus will be on building safety in the Deputy Prime Minister's line of sight. But equally, the regulator has the advantage of having enough skin in the game up to this point. As Pete says, we're 7 years on from what happened in June, and we've got to be recognising that irrespective of directives or regulations, I would hope most of the industry would have seen what happened on the 14th of June 2017 and gone, crikey, we need to do better now and be getting on with this. So in the scenario that is presented in terms of, is it reasonable? Is it proportionate to suggest that you've got a whole stack of information there for every single asset? Probably not, because we could be building owners, and building owners change buildings, right? So we buy buildings, we inherit buildings. Sometimes we, they're Section 106 agreements, for example, that if you haven't worked into the contracts at the time of handover, that you want this information, you're not going to get it.
No.
So what do you do in those instances? And that comes back to the cultural practices that I mentioned earlier on. So there is a degree of sympathy that I have for those building owners that find themselves in the position, not necessarily their fault, where they are absent of any legacy information and now absent of any specific procedural elements to be able to obtain that. But with that same breath, I will still assert that we are a long way ahead of where we were, where we all knew as an industry what we needed to do. And as we identified earlier on, we had information management provisions in the previous regulations.
I think one of the things the biggest change I think that people have been slow to grasp is the fact that the regulator comes from a different environment, the HSE. So if you've worked with the HSE in different environments, it's very clear it's the duty holder's responsibility. Whereas my experience in the fire industry as a regulator with building control was you were almost, we're there to help people, we'll help you do this and we'll provide you. Whereas the HSE is very clear, it's the duty holder's responsibility.
Right. Yes.
So the question is that is causing some problems, I'd suggest, in various areas, in the sense they won't give you a schema to say, go and do it this way, go and do it that way. It's the functional way of approaching things, and people have got to get used to that. And part of the golden thread is a really important part of that. If you haven't got the information to start with, how can you start managing a building? It's that simple. It's the duty holder's responsibility to find the information out. And I think your point's well made. It's the degree in what you can find out and what you've got. You've got to decide what's important for you to develop that safety case and manage that building safely, which isn't an unreasonable expectation, I don't think.
No.
Do you think we've how would you summarise our progress in 7 years?
I've got no metric to go against. I think when we look at, and unfortunately this is, I'm the grey-haired person sitting here, and I can chart my way back to get into all the history of fire safety and involve. I was a regulator in the underground system. Off
Pete's golden thread.
Exactly, but they were very industry specific in terms of sports grounds, licensed premises. They were very particular. I think when we're now talking about housing generally, we've got such a larger piece in terms of where it sits, and also because of the fact it involves a house, someone's dwelling, and all the issues of that, we have got another level of complexity within it that when we've had previous issues to deal with, it wasn't quite as simple to regulate in that respect. Sure. Because when you look at, we've talked about social housing, but housing full stop, you've got the interplay between the Fire Safety Order, the Building Safety Act, the housing regulations, for a start. We've got all those bits that come into play, let alone all the other issues involved with in terms of cost, and as we're now going to see with the new administration, the pressure to build more houses and planning as well.
And then have the complexity of leaseholders.
Exactly. I do think it's another order of complexity. Although as a fire engineer, I don't think the problems are technically that difficult to solve. I think anyone would disagree with me there. They're not, but the question is about the management of the risk and understanding where responsibility sits, and that's where we've been for the last 7 years. I think that that's the part that's overshadowed it in that sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's sad that we come to the end of the podcast, really, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think we'd certainly like to have both guests on again.
I could definitely see Golden Thread 2.
Well, it's a lot to unpack in a short space of time, isn't it?
It is, but I think it's really important. I mean, you can only go into a certain degree of depth, right? Over a half-hour chat in an extremely hot studio. But I think I think the listeners will appreciate what you guys have already unpacked, and I think there's a lot of food for thought in that. And I hope that you'll, if you're happy to, come back at some point later on in the series, perhaps to do something else, and maybe we can talk in the background about where we think this conversation goes, so people can listen in and learn a little more.
Do we need a positive note to finish off on?
I think it would be remiss of us not to at least try to lighten the
Tom,
mood.
would you like to hear about Smokey the fire dog?
I've been waiting for Smokey the fire dog, having listened to the trials and tribulations.
Or would you rather hear about Ratty the fire
Fire
rat?
beavers was what we got last time, gentlemen. But now we are on. I want to hear. Would you like the dog or the rat? You guys choose.
My daughters will kill me if I don't pick the dog.
Okay.
Then Smokey the fire dog it is, Dave.
So this is from a Facebook post on Oregon's South Coast Humane Society. A firefighter will be training a puppy. This is all you need to know about the story wrapped up in the first sentence. A firefighter will be training a puppy who survived a house fire to teach children about fire safety.
Lovely.
According to Facebook posts, a puppy named Smokey was rescued from a house fire, has found his forever home with a local firefighter. When the puppy first arrived at the shelter, the staff discovered that he had sustained several wounds, including burns to his back, feet and face, as well as other areas. As Smokey's skin healed, the firefighter and his wife bonded, consistently visiting the pup to form a bond. Once the shelter was confident that his skin was on the mend and he could go home, Smokey was immediately adopted by the fireman and his family.
Lovely.
It does beg the question. What question does it beg, Tom?
Has the dog not been through enough?
Well,
that it needs to do
beg,
fire
how
forever?
does Smokey the dog teach you to fire safety?
Well, absolutely. You're going to tell me though, aren't you?
Smoking will be helping teach children about the basic rules of fire safety, and by demonstrating to them being an advocate for the stop, drop and roll presentation.
Are they going to teach him to roll over?
Yeah.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say he's
school
developed
is-
a software tool for the golden
Yeah.
Very advanced dog. He's not Bluey. He's not Bluey.
No,
It's not Bluey.
absolutely.
Yeah, Bluey does
Very
fire
few dogs are
safety.
bluey. Yeah.
Yeah, yes. Yeah.
What a wonderful story. Thank you,
Yeah, we'll
Dave.
put a picture of Smokey the dog up on our LinkedIn.
Yeah, go and find it and like it. Let's see if we can get Smokey to get more likes than you this week on something. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
We
Thank
really
you. Thanks for
appreciate
having
it, and
us.
I'm sure our listeners appreciate it. Obviously, we are independent, despite the fact that Dave works for Frankham's and I work for CLM, and we paid for it. But we are an independent show, and obviously, it'd be great if people went onto LinkedIn and liked and shared.
Yeah, we want to invite as many collaborations from across the industry.
course.
We know other fire consultancies, other passive fire companies, everyone, because we're all talking about
Absolutely.
the same issues.
And if you want to ask us questions that we can ask any of our guests going forward, then you can LinkedIn message either Dave or I, or put a comment on the LinkedIn post that we put through our LinkedIn page. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers, chaps.
Thank you.
See you later, Tom.
Take care. See you soon.